Good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon. My name is Laura Igo. I'm the Jerry and Marguerite Lenfest Chief Curator here at the Michener Art Museum. It's a pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon to the museum. And it's also a pleasure to introduce to you Bruce Katsiff. Born in Philadelphia, Bruce Katsiff studied photography at Rochester Institute of Technology and Pratt Institute, earning a BFA and MFA degrees after graduating from Central High School. He completed postgraduate studies at Oxford University. His work has been exhibited in many museums and galleries, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Delaware Art Museum, the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, the Erie Art Museum, and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. For 25 years, he taught photography and was a college arts administrator, chairing the Department of Fine Art at Bucks County Community College. Bruce served as director and CEO of the Michener Art Museum from 1989 to 2012. During his tenure, over 2,500 works were added to the permanent collection, and over 62,000 square feet of galleries, storage vaults, public spaces, and educational classrooms were added to the museum's facility. In addition, the museum was accredited by the American Alliance of Museums, and the endowment grew by over $14 million, with annual attendance exceeding 100,000 visitors and over 4,000 members. His lecture today, I'm sure, will tell many stories of this time here, and it is called Building the Collection, the Soul of the Museum, and we'll particularly review the early history of the museum's art acquisition. So please join me in welcoming Bruce.
Thank you very much for the kind words. Folks, it's a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon, and I appreciate all of you spending some time with us this afternoon. I could talk about a variety of subjects with regard to the museum. I worked here for 23 years, and it was a great experience, but the focus of today's talk is really about building the collection. You know, museums, to build a museum, you need three things. You need a site, you need a facility, and you need a collection. And those things can come in any order. There are some institutions where the collection came first, the building, the site came later. In the case of this institution, it was the site that was the first thing that was acquired. And the site, as you all know, is this wonderful site designed by Addison Hutton, the original prison in Bucks County. The prison was actually closed by order of a federal judge who looked at the prison and said, it's an inhumane situation. Prison was created by the Quakers, who believed that individuals should be placed in solitary confinement and they would find their inner light. By the time that the prison closed, there were 4 inmates in each cell, and the prison was closed and a new prison was built. And then the question arose what to do with the site. Actually, the Chamber of Commerce, the Doylestown, Bucks County Chamber of Commerce, put together a committee of architects who took a look at the site. And one of the things that happened was this idea that maybe the site could be used as an arts center. It was a good idea. And actually, in 1988, this place opened as the James A. Michener Arts Center. The original notion was that it was going to be a multidisciplinary institution. It would do some visual arts, it would do some theater, it would do a wide variety of things. I was hired in 1988, and when I arrived, I began talking with the board about the idea that maybe we should be a little more focused in what this place is going to be. And actually, talk about creating a museum in Bucks County, believe it or not, goes back to the 1970s, the early 1970s, when there was a county commissioner in Bucks County by the name of Denver Linley. Denver Linley was interesting in that he was a politician and an artist. You don't usually find artists as politicians. But Denver was a painter. His father taught at Princeton University. He was county commissioner, and he created something called the Bucks County Council on the Arts. And the Bucks County Council on the Arts was the predecessor that eventually was to become the James A. Michener Art Museum. So, as I said, when, when I arrived, we decided that we were going to really build a museum. We weren't really going to do an arts center. This place, however, had one really remarkable asset that no other institution had, and it was really important to the growth of the place. And that was this guy, James A. Michener. Have we got the right slide up? Yeah, okay. I can't see, so you'll have to tell me if the wrong slide comes up. You know, Michener, as many of you know, is a foundling of uncertain parentage, brought up in Doylestown. He was a very poor child. Actually, there's a story about one Christmas when Jim gets as a Christmas present a piece of carbon paper, okay? And he was just thrilled with getting this piece of carbon paper. He actually spent some time in the poorhouse. His family was very poor. Jim, however, wins a scholarship to Swarthmore, a basketball scholarship, goes to Swarthmore, it changes his life. Jim was to become really a citizen of the world. In his day, he was arguably the most popular writer in America, really a well-known individual. Jim was also somebody who taught America about racial and ethnic diversity. And he was teaching those lessons at a time when America really wasn't interested in that subject. Jim's book, Tales of South Pacific, was banned in South Africa because of the interracial marriage. And Jim would often talk about the fact that his marriage to Mari was illegal in 30 states across America because during his lifetime, during my lifetime, the anti-misogyny laws were strong in many American states. But not only was Jim an author and a writer, he was a friend also, he was a Quaker. Jim was also a significant philanthropist. Jim believed in giving back to the community, and he believed that it was his responsibility to help the arts anywhere that he could. So Jim, and here's a list of a whole variety of projects that Jim, and institutions that Jim helped. Certainly, one of the most important was the University of Texas. Jim was in his time, Jim was the largest individual contributor to the University of Texas. He got there when he first went to Texas in the 1930s, but eventually he was the person who was to write the history of Texas in the book Centennial. Jim also made significant contributions to Kent State University. Some of you may recall that during the Vietnam era, there was a shooting at Kent State where several students were killed by National Guard who fired on the protesters. Jim went to Kent State, wrote a book about Kent State, but he said, "I will not profit from that tragedy." And he donated all of the proceeds from his book to Kent State. But that's just one of many philanthropic activities that Jim was involved in. And when this place opened as the James A. Michener Arts Center, he did make a $1 million gift to help start the museum's endowment. But Jim was not going to come in with a huge pile of money because he was very suspicious of this place. He was worried about whether this place would be able to sustain itself. Jim talked about this idea that he knew many small communities with great excitement tried to build a museum, but they couldn't sustain it. And he was worried that his name would be tied to something that maybe 20 years from now he wouldn't be interested in. So he did make an initial $1 million gift, but then he stepped back and he said, "I want to see what the community is going to do before I decide whether or not I'm going to move any further." So how did Jim Michener get tied to this place? What's the connection? Well, the connection actually goes right through Herman Silverman. Herman Silverman and Jim Michener met each other when they were both members of the Veterans of Foreign Wars after World War II. That's where they encountered one another. Herman also grew up in this area and attended Del Valle College when it was the agricultural school. Herman and Jim became very close friends and had a lifetime of friendship. And when the county was thinking about creating the Arts Center, the then County Commissioner Lucille Trench went to Herman and said, "Herman, You know Jim Michener, don't you? I think you should go to Texas and see if Jim Michener will lend his name to this arts center we're going to create. Well, Herman agreed to do that. He traveled to Texas, and lo and behold, Jim reluctantly did agree to lend his name to. It's interesting because one of the things Jim didn't do was to put his name on things. In fact, at the University of Texas, one of the things that Jim started was something called the Texas Center for Writers, which is a graduate program for students who are interested in writing, free tuition, $6,000 stipend. It was not called the Michener Center for Writers. It was called the Texas Center for Writers. It was only after Jim died that the university changed the name to put Jim's name on it, because Jim was never interested in putting his name on things. So Herman came in, Jim's name comes on our place, and think about this. How far would this place have gotten if it was called the Pine Street Museum? I don't think it would have made the progress that it made. But Jim's name was really important. Jim used to say to me, Bruce, remember, my name is like capital, and it's your job to invest it, to invest my name well and get returns for the community as a result of it. This, of course, is what the Buyers Gallery looked like when the prison closed. The cells were torn down. As I said, there was a committee of the chamber, actually, that offered some advice for what to do. The cells were torn down, and this was the guard station, which was in the center. It was a pinwheel design. So the cells went out like the spokes of a wheel. And the guards would stay in the center station. Well, I talked about the idea of 3 things to build a museum. So the first thing we had to do, and incidentally, I was hired in 1989. So I came on board a year after the Arts Center opened. And when I came on board, we changed our mind and we said, no, we're going to try to build a museum. That was a really remarkably, it took a great deal of hubris to say that we're going to build a museum. This is a community, a region rich with world-class museums. And the notion that we were going to start a museum that was going to become credible, we had a lot of guts and a lot of courage. And here we have, Lynn Taylor, who was the first architect that we hired. And actually, one of Lynn's assistants, Ellen Happ, is with us. Ellen was one of the architects that worked on the project. So working with Lynn, we decided that we were going to build a museum facility. And that meant building a facility that would meet national standards. Because if we were going to be a museum, we had to be able to borrow work from other institutions around the country. And that required that we had certain things like climate control, not just temperature control, but also humidity control. That we had a certain degree of fire protection, a certain amount of security, that we would have storage space, that we would also control the light levels, all of the things that are part of a professional museum. So with Lynn's work, with Ellen's help, and with Toby Hoffman, who was the other architect working in Lynn's office, we launched a capital campaign, and lo and behold, we built the museum, or at least we built the first part. I could do a separate lecture on the history of the architects that we worked with, because we actually worked with 4 different architectural firms during the course of those 23 years, building the various buildings of the museum. Jim was also a collector, in addition to everything else, and he had built 2 collections in his lifetime. First, he had a collection of Japanese prints, ukiyo-e prints. He worked with a curator at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and he built an enormous collection. He was to write several books on Japanese prints, The Floating World being one of the most important ones that he did. And when he returned to Bucks County after winning the Pulitzer, he decided that he was going to build a collection of American art, of paintings. And in very disciplined fashion, because Jim was always very disciplined, he decided that he would spend $75,000 a year, and he would not spend more than $5,000 on any individual artist. The other decision that he made was, whenever possible, he would buy directly from the artists. Because one of the things Jim didn't like was dealers who got rich on the work of dead artists. So he was always trying to buy the work directly from the artist. So over the course of about 15 years, he built a collection of about 300 American paintings that basically spanned his lifetime. If he had given either of those collections to this institution, it would have been a grand start for the institution. The only problem was he had already given the collections away. He gave the art collection to the University of Texas, and he gave the ukiyo-e, the Japanese print collection, to the Honolulu Academy of Art. In fact, one of the remarkable things about Jim Michener is that, there are many collectors who go to their graves shrouded with their collection. Jim's collecting was all about learning about the artists. And once he had finished the learning, he gave away the collection. In fact, when I was visiting with Jim and Laurie, they were asking, do you have any posters from the museum? We need some decoration to put up in our apartment. These are people who had, Jim's collection was really remarkable. One of the stories that's important about Jim's collection and the gift to the University of Texas, Jim considered various places to give that collection, and he understood, as good as his collection was, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, his collection would have been lost. But at the University of Texas, his collection was the most important collection of American painting that was east of LA and west of New York. So he understood that, and you're going to hear how I used Jim's argument years later to acquire a collection that we received here at the Michener. When Jim came to, and this was the picture, Jim is here and he's looking as construction's underway. He wants to help us build the collection. He doesn't want to spend a lot of money, again, because most of these artists that we are collecting were dead. So he comes up with this idea. He says, I'm going to create a challenge grant, but this is going to be an unusual challenge grant. I will commit to make a $500,000 gift to the museum's endowment, but I want that to be matched not by money, but by the gifts of artwork. So Jim said, I want to see 40 museum quality works donated to the collection. Really interesting. It was an interesting idea, and we decided that we were going to try to move forward with it. So my job becomes then to negotiate the details with Jim. And actually, these are printouts of 2 letters from Jim. And you'll notice that before the editors got to his work, there were a lot of crossing out, a lot of changing, where we're talking about how we're going to do this. What are the details of it? How are we going to decide whether it's a museum quality? How will we certify to Jim that we've met the challenge? Because one of the things about Michener was that he mistrusted museum directors. He said, museum directors, they fritter away all the money on parties and fancy stuff. So he wasn't going to trust my view. I couldn't just call him up and say, oh, we've met the challenge. We had to have a formal structure that we could do it under. And what we did was we used the museum's collection committee. And fortunately, at the time, the chair of the collections committee was Pete Beester. Pete Beester was a former congressman from Bucks County, and he was a judge on the Bucks County bench at the time. And Jim respected Pete Beester, and Pete and the collections committee were going to decide whether or not the donated object was an object that would meet the criteria of being a museum quality work. The other important thing is to remember that we decided on what we were going to collect. If you're going to build a museum, and if you're going to collect, you got to decide what it is I'm going to collect. The idea that we would try to build a comprehensive international museum like the Philadelphia Museum of Art would be totally ridiculous. We'd never get anywhere. Or even to suggest that we were going to build a museum of American art was beyond our means. We would never equal what the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts had. So what we said we're going to do is we're going to build a collection of artists from the region, because there were some really significant artists who lived in the Bucks County area. I've always made the argument that there were 3 qualities of Bucks County that helped to create the artistic environment in this community. First of all, there was the proximity to New York and Philadelphia. Okay, that was important because there were a lot of art schools. Philadelphia, remember, had the first art schools in Philadelphia, and there were 5 art schools in Philadelphia. So proximity to New York and Philadelphia. Second thing was the physical beauty of this area. The rural Bucks County was, but the very important element was the Quaker values of tolerance. There was that tolerance for people of diverse lifestyles. You put those 3 things together and you understand why many people came from New York to live in Bucks County, and was really the seed that helped to grow into the artistic traditions of Bucks County. So one of the things that we did as part of the endowment challenge was we came up with a list of names of the artists that we were interested in. So, you know, if you had a Jasper Johns, that wouldn't meet the criteria. Although if a Jasper Johns had been offered, we might have bent the rules. But so we put together a list of the names of the artists. And the first thing I did, excuse me, is I sent a letter out to all of our friends and members, telling them about the Michener Endowment Challenge and giving them the list of artists whose works we were interested in. Well, this endowment challenge really caught fire, okay? The story gets picked up by the AP Wire. The story plays nationally. And here you see on one side an article that was in the Inquirer. Good old Ed Szanski, I believe, is the author of this article, and it talks about the Michener Endowment Challenge. But on your right side is an article that appeared in the Washington Post. So here's the Washington Post talking about this Michener Endowment Challenge. So that was one of the, again, this was how Michener's national name was so important to our success. Well, the Endowment Challenge is off and running, and lo and behold, one of the first people to step forward is Dr. Kenneth Leiby. Dr. Leiby is a physician. He came to New Hope in the 1930s. Dr. Leiby used to say he delivered over 2,000 babies in the River Valley. And one of the things that Dr. Leiby would do is he would trade medical services for artwork. And some of his patients were people like Daniel Garber and William Lathrop. So Leiby had a terrific small collection of Bucks County artists, and he also knew Michener, so he was excited to go forward and give his collection to us. I will tell you that when someone decides to give the collection to the museum, it very often doesn't make their members of their family happy. The heirs are generally not happy that the museum gets the collection. So Dr. Leiby gives us his collection, and I want to just talk a little bit about one of the works that was in Dr. Leiby's collection, this work by Henry Snell called The Barber Shop, because it speaks to this incredible relationship between artists and the local community. This is actually a painting. The view is from Snell's apartment in New Hope. The white building that you're looking at is Dr. Leiby, where Dr. Leiby's home and office was. And how Leiby acquired this painting is just a wonderful story. Dr. Leiby is with Mrs. Snell when Henry is on his deathbed. Henry dies. Dr. Leiby and Mrs. Snell walk out of the bedroom, go into the living room, and hanging in the living room is this painting by Snell. Mrs. Snell goes up to the painting, takes it off the wall, and says, "Dr. Leiby, Henry would want thee to have this painting." That's how he acquired this Leiby picture, and he wound up giving it to us. Here are some other examples of works that were donated during the Michener Endowment Challenge. This is a work by Daniel Garber, Garden Window. A work by William Lathrop, a landscape. A favorite of mine, a work by Elsie Driggs, this really wonderful, wonderful drawing of the deer. This is another interesting piece, Charles Child. This was a study for the curtain at the Bucks County Theater. Henry Leith Ross, Days Long Past. A work by Clarence Carter from the Over and Above series. and finally a Daniel Garber Day in June. When all was said and done, 189 objects came into the collection with the Michener Endowment Challenge. And Pete Beester was able to certify to Jim that we had met the challenge. But there is something that was really remarkable that became the next step, that was really a byproduct of the Endowment Challenge that we never could have guessed it would have happened. What are we looking at? This is the entrance to the sesquicentennial in Philadelphia in 1926. A 7-story high Liberty Bell that you would drive your car under on your way to this celebration of the 150th anniversary of America. One of the buildings in the sesquicentennial is the Pennsylvania building, which was decorated with murals. And one of the murals in that building was done by Daniel Garber. Garber was teaching at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He was teaching mural painting in addition to easel painting. And he is commissioned to do a mural that honors the forest and the wood industry of Pennsylvania. So Garber does this large 22-foot-long mural with a lunette outline, and he paints it, and it is installed in this building, the Pennsylvania building at the sesquicentennial. I have to keep my centennials straight. The 150th anniversary, not the bicentennial. The sesquicentennial is not successful. It rains 70% of the time. The attendance is far below what's expected. And when the project closes, they have to decide what to do with all the stuff that's left over. Well, the Garber mural, they say, there's this new forestry school that's being created in Mount Alto to teach forestry. Maybe that'd be a good place for this painting. So they decide to donate the painting to the forestry school, and it's going to be installed in the back of their auditorium. And Garber writes some instructions about how to do it, and it gets installed back there. We really did not know where it was. We knew that Garber had this commissioned mural. We heard that it went to Penn State, but we didn't know where it was. One day, we get a phone call. The librarian at the campus, now the State Forestry School became a branch campus of Penn State University, so it was the Mount Alto campus. Working at that campus is a librarian, Marjorie Blumbaugh. She reads an article in the local newspaper about the Michener Endowment Challenge. She picks up the phone, she calls the museum, talks to the switchboard and says, we've got this painting done by Daniel Garber. Maybe you'd be interested. Needless to say, that's the kind of phone call a museum director returns. So I called them up, and lo and behold, yes, it was the Garber mural. So I arranged for us to drive up there to see it. I get Carolyn Smith, who at the time was our board president, remarkable woman, really. Carolyn Smith, this place wouldn't be here today without Carolyn Smith and her leadership on the board. And Dana Appelstein, Garber's granddaughter. We get in the car and we drive up to Mount Alto to look at this mural. We get into the auditorium, and there in the back of the stage is this dark thing. What is it back there? And my heart sinks, and I say, oh, this is a waste of time. What are we here? But there's some lights in the back of the stage, so I plug in a light, and I take a light and I shine it up on the mural. Oh my God, this thing it's real, and it really has some life left in it. And there at the back of the stage is this Garber mural. Now it's got 19 holes in the canvas because it's been ripped. And what happened to the ends of it? Are the ends of it there? And the school had put up some plastic barricades, plastic sheets in order to protect it, but it really had lots of holes. So we begin to talk about the possibility of, can we acquire this? And then another important person comes into the picture, and that's Dr. Corinne Caudwell. Dr. Caudwell is the president of the campus, and I begin to talk to her to negotiate the possibility that we will acquire this piece for the Michener. Fortunately, the Palmer Museum at Penn State University isn't interested in the work. If they had been interested, I suspect we never would have gotten it. But to her credit, there is Corinne. Corinne is in the audience. Corinne is the person who, Corinne and I often talk about the idea that we both love to talk about our mural. Because Corinne was a college president who had the guts to make a decision. And what we did was we endowed a scholarship in Garber's name at the campus, and they agreed to transfer the painting to us where we were going to conserve it. Well, there's one problem, and the one problem was money, because $50,000 was how much it cost for us to endow the scholarship, but we were estimating that the restoration was going to be something in the neighborhood of $150,000 to restore the work. There was a state senator by the name of Craig Lewis. A year or two before that, I had been walking through the museum with this state senator, and he took me aside and he said, "You know, Bruce, someday I'd like to do something really big for the museum." I never forget remarks like that. So I picked up the phone, I called Craig, and I said, "You know, Craig, I think I've got just the thing for you to fund." So Craig gets us a legislative initiative grant, which we used to actually call WHAM grants. WHAM stood for walking around money, okay? Craig gets us a WHAM grant for $170,000 or $180,000. We endow the scholarship, and we decide we're going to restore this canvas. So we hire, and incidentally, Judy Heyman, who at the time was our associate director, really managed much of this work. We hired Barbara Buckley. Barbara Buckley is a conservator, a painting conservator. She's now the head conservator at the Barnes Foundation. Very capable, and her husband, Mark Bachroff, is also a conservator. We hire them to conserve this work. So we go to Mount Alto, and they're going to take the work off of the auditorium, and here it is. The work has been removed from the thing, and we discover, much to our delight, they didn't cut the ends off. They folded the ends back, so they were still there. And again, if you look on the right side, you'll see all the cigarette butts that were placed behind the canvas as they would throw the cigarette butts in the small hole behind the canvas. So the first thing was to get the painting out of Mount Alto and take it to be conserved. So the conservators built this wooden frame that they would roll the canvas on with interleafing in between it. But here was the next problem. Barbara was a great conservator, but she didn't have a studio big enough to put a 22-foot by 12-foot canvas. So what did we do? We rented a warehouse near her home that had climate control for her to work on the picture. And here it is, installed in the warehouse, this huge mural, as Barbara and her crew begin the restoration of the work. And here they are doing some of the in-painting. One of the fortunate things was that Garber, for some reason, had decided not to varnish this canvas. So that makes the restoration actually much easier, because they didn't have to remove the varnish from this huge canvas. But we did decide to varnish after they did the restoration. They had to repair the holes in the canvas, they had to flatten it, they had to build a new frame for it, and then eventually they had to do the in-painting. One of the ideas, two of the basic ideas of conservation in the modern world are, one of the rules is do as little as possible. When in doubt, do nothing. And whatever you do has to be reversible. Those are the three rules that are kind of the Bibles of modern day conservation work. So they did all that work, they conserved the painting. Interesting. It took Garber 6 weeks to do the mural. How long did it take the conservators to conserve it? 6 months for the conservators to conserve the work. And there is a much younger Bruce Katsiff and Barbara Buckley in front of the mural. The final step was we had to bring the mural back to the museum. Well, they didn't want to roll it on the way back because the varnish was on there and they were afraid it might crack. So we had to find a truck that it would fit in. But the final challenge was we had to get it in the building. So when we designed this building, it was designed around the ability to move a 10-foot object onto the loading dock, onto the elevator, and up to the galleries. But the Putnam Smith Gallery has a 14-foot high ceiling. So one of the things that we did was when we had the architects do the emergency exit, we told them, put an exit door up top. So if we ever get a really large piece, we'll be able to get it in the building. Well, almost as if it knew that this was going to happen, that's how we got the Garber mural in, because we had planned for the possibility of a large piece. It's a lesson I learned from a museum that bought an Ansel Kiefer and couldn't get it into the building because it was too small. So they moved it into the building, and then we decided to build a false wall in front of it. We had a terrific designer, Charles Frome, who designed the whole installation. We built the false wall in front of it, and lo and behold, we finally wound up with what we believe would become one of the signature pieces of the museum, the Garber mural installed in the Putnam Pavilion. Not in the Putnam Pavilion, in the Putnam Smith Gallery. So now, the Garber mural becomes the hook for the next stage. I'm telling you, it's almost as if these things were planned, but they weren't. Because the next stage is this guy, Jerry Lenfest. Who's Jerry Lenfest? Jerry Lenfest is an attorney. Okay, he gets a job as in-house counsel for Walter Annenberg. Okay, Walter Annenberg, a communications czar. At one point, Annenberg is forced to divest. The government says too much communications in one person's hands, so it's forced to divest. And when and at the time, Annenberg owns a small cable station. Jerry Lenfest goes to Annenberg and says, Walter, you know, I'd like to buy that cable station from you. I'd like to try to be a businessman. And Walter says, Jerry, I like you, you're a nice guy, but I want $2 million for that thing, and you don't have any money. So Jerry goes out and finds some investors, and they buy the station, and it becomes Suburban Cable. 25 years later, Jerry sells the company to Comcast, to Ralph Roberts at Comcast, for a mere $6 billion. Nice return on his investment. Jerry was also a collector of Pennsylvania Impressionist work because he was advised by two dealers, Malcolm Polis from the Plymouth Meeting Gallery and Roy Pedersen from the Pedersen Gallery. And his idea was that he would buy works in areas where his cable company serviced people. So he built this really large collection of Pennsylvania Impressionist pictures. And one of the problems that Jerry had was he just sold the business. All these paintings were hanging in his corporate offices. So he had to get rid of them. He had to make a decision relatively quickly to get rid of these paintings because he had nowhere to put them. So one morning I woke up in Lumberville and looked at the local paper and read this article about Jerry Lenfest having just sold the thing. And I said to myself, you know, we got to get to this guy. We got to get to this guy because we got to talk him into giving us the collection. So my chief curator at the time, Brian Peterson, and I go up to visit Jerry and tour the collection. And while Brian is out looking at the paintings, I sit down with Jerry to have a talk with him. And he looks at me, and the first thing he says to me is, I'm not going to give you any money. And I say, Jerry, I'm not here to ask for money. And he says to me, you're supposed to ask for money. You run a nonprofit. So I begin to talk to Jerry and suggest that he give the collection. And I use the same argument that Michener used about his collection going to Texas. Jerry at the time is the chairman of the board of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, okay? And I keep telling Jerry, look, Jerry, your collection's terrific, but you know, it doesn't mean anything to the Philadelphia Museum. It's really going to be insignificant. You give your collection to us, it's transformative. I say, Jerry, look, the Philadelphia Museum, they own about 6 Pennsylvania Impressionist pictures, but they're all in the basement, they're in the storage. Not one of them's on exhibit. And Jerry says, yeah, but that's because they don't have any space. And I say, wait a minute. There are 4,000 paintings hanging at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and there isn't room for one Pennsylvania Impressionist picture? So Jerry starts to be thinking about it, but I got some tough competition. This is Anne Darnancourt, who at the time is the director of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. A grand lady. Anne is Marcel Duchamp's godchild, okay? Her father was the director of the Museum of Modern Art. She's about as elegant a museum director as you can imagine. In fact, one of the lines about Anne is that Anne could wrestle you to the ground with velvet gloves. Well, Anne gets wind that Jerry's thinking about giving the collection to us. So Anne arranges a meeting with Jerry. And Jerry comes to see me afterwards and he says, Bruce, I think I've been had. Anne had a meeting with me to talk about my collection. And I went into her office and she had a garber hanging in the office. And Anne says to Jerry, listen, I know you're thinking about giving the collection to the Michener. Why don't you do this? There's one painting in the collection that you can give to us and give all the rest of them to the Michener. And the one painting that Anne suggests that Jerry give to the PMA is, of course, the Redfield Brook Trout Brook, arguably the best work in the collection. Jerry, to his credit, says, no. I'm going to keep the collection together. I'm going to give the whole collection to the Michener. And I'm going to give the Michener a $3 million endowment gift to help care for the collection. Because people who give collections to museums who can afford it should give them money to care for the collection. And in further example of Jerry's action, he says, listen, I'll put no restriction on deaccessioning work for my collection. If the museum has an opportunity to get a better Redfield than the one I gave them, fine. Sell the one I gave you and replace it with a better one. I only want one thing. I want the museum to always have an exhibit of Pennsylvania Impressionist pictures up. That's the only requirement that I make. And actually, for a long time, we called it the Marguerite and Jerry Lindfest. We said to Jerry, we're also going to name our chief curator in your name. We're going to use that endowment to make sure that we have a chief curator, that we have the curatorial power to run this institution. Let's take a quick look at some of the gifts. Jerry gave us 59 paintings and a $3 million endowment gift. There are many other things that Jerry was to give us because we had maintained a relationship with Jerry for many years. Jerry Lindfest was a prince. He really was a remarkable guy. One of his commitments was that he was going to give away all the money before he died. The last thing he wanted was a foundation to exist 20 years later that would be giving money to things that he wouldn't want to support. And Jerry Lindfest, incidentally, is the person who saved the Philadelphia Inquirer. Jerry Lindfest basically owned the Inquirer and turned it into a nonprofit and gave them an endowment to help get it going. But here are some of the works that came from Jerry Lindfest. This is Fern Coppage. Daniel Garber, Stockton Steeple. William Sauter, Brace's Cove. Another Garber, Springtime in the Village. And one of my favorite of these artists, Robert Spencer, Summertime. Jerry also funded a variety of publications that the museum did. He really was he and Marguerite were quite remarkable folks. I might also add, because I think she's in the room, that the Lindfest gift wouldn't have happened but not for Carol Hurst. Is Carol in the? No, she's not. Carol at the time was there she is, was the development officer, and Carol kept saying to me, Bruce, this guy's going to make a decision. You better move quickly on this one. You better move quickly. Because I was used to moving in museum time, which is, very slow. But without Carol's advice, I don't think it would have happened. So there's some talk about three of the important steps that really were to help move towards the collection. And here's the list of all of Jerry's gifts to us. Think about this. If Jerry had given that collection to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, in part, the entire raison d'etre for this place would have been sucked away. Because of Jerry's gift, we can say the Michener has the best public collection of Pennsylvania Impressionists of any institution in the country, hands down. And it's really because of this gift from Jerry. I want to just also mention, here are some of the purchases that we did, because it's wonderful to get donations. It's great for people to give the museum works, but ultimately a museum has to also have some money to buy works, because there are times when the important works just have to be purchased. So here are some things that came to the museum through purchase. This actually was the first object that we bought. This is a William Trago painting, and we bought it because at the time, Peter Bloom was the director of the Allentown Art Museum. Peter called me one day and he said, Bruce, a dealer offered me this Trago painting. We don't want it for the Allentown, but it might be good for you folks at the Michener. I said, oh yeah, that's great. In my view, this is really, Trago is an interesting artist. He was handicapped. He studied at the Pennsylvania Academy. He used to have a cart that he would pull in order to carry his works around. This is actually a study of galloping horses. Trago was at PAFA when Muybridge came. Muybridge was invited. Muybridge was the British photographer who did the first stop-action photographs of the galloping horse. And Muybridge was invited to Philadelphia by Thomas Eakins. He lectured at the Academy. Trago's at the Academy. And if you look at this painting, what you'll see is the various stop-action images of the galloping horse that are coming out of Muybridge's photographs. This is a Lee Gatch. This was a really important piece for us to get. This is a portrait of Edward Hicks by Thomas Hicks. There actually are 3 versions of this. And actually, when we first acquired this, we were able to borrow the other 2 versions, so we exhibited all 3. This was an example where the community really came forward. The Quaker community or the Friends community, many members of that community assisted us in the acquisition of this portrait by Thomas Hicks, who was a relative of Edward Hicks. And of course, you see here is Edward as the painter, but the Bible is certainly there in the background, and you can also see a little piece of the peaceable kingdom. I know that the museum has now, as a result of the work of our current terrific curator, now does own a Hicks. We have a Penn's Treaty with the Indians Hicks that was donated to the museum. It was an important goal, one of those that I was not able to accomplish. The great thing about collections is that they keep going. This was another acquisition that was important. Again, an individual. This is the doors that were the entrance to Phil Powell's studio. And Sid Martin is the person who funded this. We bought this at auction. It was painted purple, so it was another conservation effort. Behruz Salamangerd, who is the conservator at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, did the work. But it's a terrific and important piece. This, of course, is the burning of Center Bridge by Redfield. And you know the story about this, where Edward Redfield is coming home from the city one day, and he sees these fire trucks, and he stops, and he thinks his house is on fire, because he was right next to Center Bridge. But as the story goes, he's standing there with Lathrop by his side, and Lathrop says to him, how'd you like to try to paint this picture? And Redfield goes into the studio the next day and does some sketches and eventually does this painting of the burning of Center Bridge. It was owned by Dorothy Redfield, and this was what is called in the field a bargain sale. Dorothy agreed to sell us the painting below market value. We raised the money, and then she got a deduction for the portion below market value that was donated to us. And finally, a work by Paul Keene, good friend of mine. This is from a series of things that Paul did, reminiscing of his childhood in Philadelphia, and this is the flute player. So again, the collection is really, buildings come and go, directors come and go, curators come and go, trustees come and go. The collection is really the soul of the institution. That's the really important thing. And I have to say, when I left in 2012, I believe is when I retired, when I left, there were 2,500 objects in the collection. There are now over 5,000. So Laura and her staff and the collections committee, they've been doing a great job because the collection is now twice as big. And 10 years from now, when this place has got more galleries and bigger facilities, the collection will be even bigger than that. I also want to just take a moment to thank Rebecca McCarron, who is the registrar. Rebecca helped me a lot in getting material to put this lecture together. Registrar, one of the most important jobs in the museum, and most people know nothing about what the registrar does, but boy, is the registrar important. And I also want to thank Brigida Bond. Brigida Bond is the librarian, and if there's anybody who knows everything about the Michener, it is Brigida. She knows every detail about the institution. So with that as a conclusion, I want to thank you all for your attention. I'll be happy to take some questions. I will tell you, as you can imagine, great pleasure. 23 years at this place. It was a terrific opportunity. I think that we've built an institution. I think that Jim would be proud of us if he looked down on it today and look at where it is, and you know that the place is going to be here for decades to come. So thanks so much. I think we have a little bit of time. We could take some questions if there are any. Sure, in the back, yes.
First of all, that was wonderful. Thank you. Just very engaging talk. Could you speak a little bit about the process to get the Nakashima room into the museum?
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit two things I should say. First of all, I mentioned a bunch of people's names. For every name I mentioned, there are 20 people involved in the institution whose name I didn't mention, okay? The Nakashima, certainly early on when we were doing the first construction project, I had this idea of creating a reading room. It was an idea stolen from the Allentown Art Museum. The Allentown Art Museum has a Frank Lloyd Wright library. So I was thinking, maybe we could get the Nakashimas to create a reading room. So Lynn Taylor and I met with Mira, proposed this idea. They liked it because there was a Nakashima room at the Metropolitan in New York City, Metropolitan Museum in New York City. The family supplied the furniture, but not the environment. We said to the family, we want you to do the whole room. So you do the room. So Kevin Nakashima did the Soji screens. Mira designed this place. She picked a piece of wood that George had said, don't ever sell this piece of wood, it's really special. There was another piece of wood that was originally supposed to go for tables for Andy Warhol, but Warhol had died, so we got that wood, and they developed the room. One of the funny stories about that was that, as originally planned, we were going to use the room as a place to show video. And the cabinet that's in there was designed to put a VCR in and have a screen. And after the room got built, we said, the last thing you want in this room is media. It doesn't fit. It's not the right thing. It's a peaceful environment. So there is actually there's an excellent art beat video. If you go online, YouTube, there's or actually I think it's on the museum's YouTube site. There's a terrific piece that interviews Mira and talks in detail about the development of the Nakashima room. I might add, in addition to the Nakashima room, we are the recipient of much of the Nakashima archives. Am I still correct in that, Brigitte? Or maybe not. Yes, yeah. Any other questions?
I'm wondering if you have a story of like the one that got away, or of something you really wanted for the collection, but just weren't able to acquire.
Whoa. There are a lot of stories because I wanted everything for the collection, but coming up with a specific of one that got away. No, I don't think I can. I'll have to think about that. I'll get back to you with the one that got away. But obviously, you know, our means were limited, and we didn't have unlimited resources. Well, actually, I can think about one that got away, which is we had a board chair who had a terrific collection, and not one object came to us, and that was a disappointment. So I can think of that. It would be more in terms of thinking of people who were connected to the institution, who then moved away, and we wound up not getting the collections that you would have thought would have come to the institution. Yeah.
How did you get the Uffizi exhibit to come here to Doylestown?
I was actually just recently telling Laura that story. It's a very simple story. I was at the conference of what used to be called the American Association of Museums. It's now called the American Alliance of Museums. They have an annual conference in cities across the country. And I was at the conference in Los Angeles from the American Alliance of Museums. And one of the things that happens is there are evening receptions where we get these private tours of various museums. And there's usually a bus that you go on. So I get on the bus to go to the next tour. Well, you get on the bus and you're sitting next to someone you don't know, so I start to talk to them. Oh, how are you? And what are you doing? And what are you about? And the person next to me says, oh, yes, well, I'm arranging some traveling exhibitions. Oh, and what traveling exhibitions do you do? Well, I'm working on a traveling show of work from the Uffizi Gallery. And I look at her and I say, are there any Botticellis in that show? And she says to me, yes, there are a couple Botticellis. Well, we'd be interested. So we start to negotiate, and lo and behold, this was a traveling show of religious work from the museum that was traveling to 3 museums in America. We by then were accredited by the American Alliance of Museums. Accreditation is like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. It says that, you know, you are a respectable institution that meets national standards, and we got on the list. One of the interesting things is that when that work traveled around the country, it traveled with armed guards in a follow-up car. The drivers, actually one driver had to sleep in the van as the work was traveled around, but it was a great pure luck and accident that the Uffizi exhibition, because that was one of the things, you know, what we said was that our collecting was going to be narrowly focused on artists from the region, but our exhibition activity would be broadly focused across the entire gamut of art. So our exhibition activity was not, you know, restricted to local artists. It's simply our collecting activity. So that was the kind of marriage that we created when the place was built. But that's a good example of a project we could not have gotten without being accepted. There are 2 things. The accreditation is critical, but the other thing that's critical is the publications that the museum does. The publications are the way people around the country know your institution, because most of those folks will never come to the Michener, but they'll know the institution by the publications it's done. We did a lot of publishing when I was here. Laura has been doing some terrific publishing. It's got some great things going. Although I do remember once visiting with Jim Michener, and he had a pile of our publications on his desk, and he looked at me and he said, so Bruce, are you going to bankrupt the museum with all these publications that you're doing? Because Jim thought that books made money. And in his case, they did, because he was a best-selling author. In our case, books don't make money. But they are the lasting record of the scholarship. Remember, museums are academic institutions. I mean, curators are people who have a degree of expertise in an institution. You know, Laura is a PhD art historian. She knows her stuff. And it's one of the challenges. I talk about this. You know, if I was at a hospital, I wouldn't challenge the heart surgeon's ability to do the surgery. I wouldn't begin to tell the heart surgeon, oh, well, I know I can do the surgery as well as you can. But, you know, in a museum, it's very difficult for curators because, you know, knowledge of the arts and judgment of the arts is much more subjective. So there are people who say, well, I know as much as the curators do. But in truth, they really don't. When you talk to them, you find out that the curators really have a depth of knowledge. These are people who have committed their lives to looking at and understanding artwork. And remember, it's not about what they like. I mean, I never picked work saying, oh, I'd love to have that on my living room wall. That wasn't the criteria. It wasn't whether or not I liked the work. It's what importance the work has. You know, what is its technical skill? What's its emotional ability? What connection does it have to what's happening in the art world? Those are judgments that curators make based upon really an in-depth knowledge of the field and a lot of experience. Great. Hey, thanks, folks. It was my pleasure. Thank you.